Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more The Massacre El Mozote. We are picking up where we left off in the previous episode here. So let's go ahead and hop into this. Yet, this was his strongest impression, and since the limitations caused it to be omitted, didn't they feel rather artificial at the least? That's right, he said. But that's where I guess political judgment came into it. And it was not the judgment that you would think that, the ambassadors got to make sure that the information is politically correct. It was that for the rest of the report, you have credibility among people who were far away and whose priorities were, we're talking about people like Tom Enders, whose priorities were definitely not necessarily about getting at exactly what happened. In order for the report to have credibility, all those things have to be kept to a minimum. Credibility at the embassy was the special concern for looming over its reporting was the shadow of the former ambassador Robert White, whom Reagan had cashiered and who had now become the outspoken critic of the administration's policy in El Salvador. The problem, Greentree went on, was because of Robert White before the end of Bob White's tour and the transition period before Hinton arrived, and the first 6 months of Hinton's tour. Those were the absolute worst days, really, and really out of control. And the fact that Bob White and everybody in the embassy had been so thoroughly traumatized by the murders of the nuns, and the AFL-CIO guys and just the general sort of out of control way the military was, it meant that everything we reported could be taken as suspect. Remember, we went on there as a new administration coming in that had a distinctly different approach to things. At that point, one begins to understand the pressures on the embassy and the effect of the great game of politics being played in Washington had on those who were supposedly acting within El Salvador as the eyes and ears of the United States government. Ambassador Hinton was the guy who sees the standards, Greentree said. So, of course, since I was a junior officer, my eyes were not on the policy. They were being very affected by the things I was seeing and encountering out there. From the ambassador's perspective, he had to keep his eyes on where we were supposed to be going in the country, and he had to put where the truth was in the context of that. In other words, the possibility that the guerrillas were making a major propaganda ploy over a massacre that might or might not have occurred in El Mozote. and were doing so for the purpose of derailing U.S. policy. Well, what the embassy had to say about that event had to be very, very carefully phrased and controlled, and to get as close as possible to what happened and as far away as possible from propaganda on either side, regardless of what might then happen to it once the report got to Washington and was the way or and was one way or another translated into testimony before Congress. In reality, then, the admonition to be clear and clean, to be professional and not distort, served as an excuse to exclude from the cable the very things that had most impressed the men who actually ventured into the war zone. The emphasis on clean reporting permitted the blinding and deafening of the government and served to remove from its field of perception what might have proved to be, in the Washington of early 1982, a very inconvenient fact. In place of McKay's clear impression that something horrible happened, and of Greentree's conviction that there probably had been a massacre, that they had lined people up and shot them, the cable supplied the two officials in the State Department a number of arguments that they might find useful of impeaching the press accounts of El Mozote. Deeply misleading arguments that would form the basis of the government's effort to discredit the reports of the massacre. After citing the numbers of dead and that had appeared in the Times and Washington Post, the cable noted it is estimated that no more than 300 people were in the entire canton prior to December 1981, ignoring the fact that both newspapers had made it quite clear that the massacre took place in El Mozote and in a number of hamlets around it. As for the names of the dead, subsequently reported in a U.S. press, the cable suggested that those may well have been extracts in whole or part from the civil registries, stolen from Wakayatik by subversives, though it offered no evidence whatever for this assertion. I don't recall thinking it was what happened, Greentree said when he was asked about the Wakoatik claim. But I thought it was a possibility, and yet he might have learned from Bonner, with whom Greentree was in frequent contact, that the guerrillas had shown the reporter the list several days before they attacked and captured Wakatik. So that the possibility that the names were actually drawn from captured civil registries from Huacuatique, a charge that the Assistant Secretary of State would soon be repeating to the Congress of the United States, and was not a possibility at all. El Mozote is in the heart of guerrilla territory. One reads on page 2 of the cable, and its inhabitants have spent most of the past 3 years willingly or unwillingly cooperating with the insurgents. An odd location, particularly since the next sentence notes that the fact of government forces were last posted in El Mozote in August of 1981, just 4 months before Operation Rescue. The observation about willingly or unwillingly cooperating with the insurgents echoes the attitude of the Salvadoran army, in which anyone living north of Torola must be a priori, a guerrilla follower, and was thus, in the officer's view, fair game. And yet, Greentree clearly understood that the reality was more complex. Most of these people didn't want anything to do with any of this stuff, he told me. They just wanted people to leave them alone. They were victims of this whole thing. If they could get away with giving guerrillas some corn and chickens and still live on their farms, that's what they would do. At the same time, if the people had to get by giving corn and chickens to the half a dozen Guardia Nacional who were living in their town, then they would do that. Whatever it took to enable them to live. It was the eloquent and concise statement of what the Civil War had done to many people of Morazan by 1981, but unfortunately nothing near such depth of understanding is allowed to come through in the cable. The cable concludes by noting that the Defense Attaché's office is attempting to determine which Army units were present in El Mozote during and after the operation. Of course, if the embassy wanted to discover what had happened in Morazan, this should have been the other path of inquiry, putting the question directly to the American-funded and American-trained Army. And yet, 6 weeks after the events were alleged to have taken place, the embassy reported that it had not managed to discover which units were in El Mozote. This, although at least 10 American advisors were assigned to the Atlacado, the unit accused in all the press reports. As several recently released cables confirm, however, matters were a bit more complicated. On the day Greentree and McKay made their trip to Morazan, Ambassador Hinton had a discussion with Salvadoran Defense Minister Garcia on margin of dinner, as he puts it in the cable, about El Mozote. The General Garcia had been promoted on January the 2nd, was about to make a trip to Washington to attend a congressional prayer breakfast, and the ambassador warned him that he would be ready to respond to Morazan Massacre story. General Garcia Hinton writes, was his usual cocky self. I'll deny it and prove it fabricated. I wished him well and added he would have to explain away details provided by correspondence. It might be possible we were investigating and were grateful for this help, but he should bear in mind that something had gone wrong. Who did it, when, and in what circumstances was something else. 2 days later, on the afternoon of February the 1st, an American officer from the defense attaché's office, it was, as it happened, Major John McKay, traveled out to the Atlacatl headquarters, where he was received by, among others, Major Caceres, Major Jose Armando Azmedia Melara, and Lieutenant Colonel Monterosa. McKay's mission was, he wrote in a subsequent cable, to specially determine if the battalion or elements thereof were involved in the fighting around and in El Mozote. After meetings and pleasantries were exchanged, the American put his question to the colonel. Monterosa remained distantly courteous, but he firmly told R.O., reporting officer, that he was not in the position to discuss these specific subjects, and that R.O. had better obtain permission from the general staff up the Atlacatl forces before he came with such inquiries to his Lieutenant Colonel Monterosa's battalion. Things had begun badly, McKay reports. Quite frankly, I felt that the interview, albeit short, was thus to be terminated. The American hastened to make the obligatory apologies for what the colonel may have interpreted as impertinence. R.O. also pointed out that the candid answers to the questions posted would facilitate countering recent press releases which were less than complimentary to the armed forces of El Salvador. Major Azmedia now spoke in what can only be described as a parable, explaining that the unit that had fought at El Mozote had a tough time of it, and that because of the intensity and duration of the battle, there were undoubtedly casualties among the non-combatants. Colonel Monterosa put in that the unit involved had to fight through and had to fight through fixed enemy positions. Then, once in the town, fire was received from the houses in the town. Here, according to the American officer, Monterosa now utilized the first person. I do not have x-ray vision and I cannot see inside the house from which someone is shooting at me, nor in those type of circumstances am I very disposed to waste time trying to find out who else might be in the house. At this point, Lieutenant Colonel Monterosa said he was only speaking in general, not specific terms, about what had occurred at El Mozote. So yeah, we'll go ahead and end this piece there. So, they talk about how the military saw it. Oh, we were fired upon, is what they claimed. Yet, there was no evidence of this. None. No proof, no weapons, no nothing. Typical lies. To save their own skin. But yeah. That'll be it for this episode. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.